In Sweden, there exists an idea of pure love that is built on not on mutual dependence, but on a strong foundation of autonomy. This idea is present both in the national culture and the institutions of the modern Swedish welfare state. But why do Swedes value independence so much? And how has this influenced the Swedish culture, society, and relationships? Today, I will discuss these with my guest as I am joined by Dr. Lars Trägårdh, the Swedish historian and professor of history and civil society studies at Ersta, Sköndal, Bräcke University College in Sweden. He's the co-author of the book, The Swedish Theory of Love. Hi, Dr. Lars. I welcome you to the program and thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to be here.
Okay, great. So because we will be talking about Swedish love and your book, The Swedish Theory of Love, I want to start with this question. What is the Swedish theory of love and where did it come from?
Well, I mean, first of all, the title, Swedish original is in some sense even more kind of provocative. It's called Är svenska människa, Are Swedes Human?
Oh,
and, yeah. And this we took from a book that was published in 1946 by a unhappy Swedish journalist who was very unhappy with Sweden. He felt Swedes were far too focused on their autonomy and independence, and they were not sufficiently attached to more traditional ideals like the family and the community. So he was very concerned about the sort of excessive individualism that he felt permeated Swedish society. That Swedes seemed to be obsessed, right, with autonomy, with being free and independent, and so this fits very well into some thinking that I had had for a long time, and I coined two terms to try to grasp this peculiarity of the Swedish social contract. And one was a sort of top-down idea, which I call statist individualism, right? That had to do with a particular type of individualism that had to do with a compact, an alliance between the state on the one hand and the individual citizen on the other. And that, became institutionalized in a number of ways that we may talk about shortly. But to understand this, you also had to understand it from the point of view of the citizen. What's in it for them, right? Because after all, Sweden was a democracy, or is still a democracy. So Swedes have voted, right, for these changes, these forms of institutions that promoted this radical form of individualism for a long, long time. You can't really blame it on trigger-happy social engineers or some sort of autocratic ruler, because this is a choice made by the citizens themselves. So that's why I came up with this idea, the Swedish theory of love, as a way to explain it from an existential point of view, right? For you and I, right, as individuals, right? What's in it for us, with this system? And what the Swedish theory of love sort of postulates, right, in a slightly provocative way, is that Swedes prefer to have even their intimate personal relationships, right, within the family, with friends, with relatives, with neighbors and so forth, based on voluntariness, equality, and autonomy. That is to say that you want to be in relationships. It's not like Swedes are sort of so asocial as to be not human, even though some people would argue that they are a little asocial at times. But it's about that they want the relationships to be built right on that foundation, rather than being built on duties and having to be sort of, in a way, forced into social relations that they cannot escape. So voluntariness here is a really critical feature of the Swedish theory of love. So that's at least an intro to the topic.
Yeah, I understand. And you know what? I'm very happy to have you on the program today, because what I'm going to tell you today, it might interest you. After I came across the Swedish Theory of Love, I actually got it in the Finnish journalist Anu Partanen's book, The Nordic Theory of Everything. I told you in the email. And I think I read the book first in 2018 or 19. And since then, I have been obsessed with this idea and thinking about this theory of love in the Nordic countries constantly. And I think I am the only person in this world, maybe so far, who is going to tell you this. After I came across this Nordic theory of love, or the Swedish theory of love, whatever you want to call it, I have been thinking that in my country, in Bangladesh, the idea of marriage and relationship is not actually that good when I compare it with the Swedish theory of love. You know what? Because maybe if I have time, I'm going to tell you what happened in my life, because in the Bangladeshi culture, the Bangladeshi idea of love is everything that the Swedish theory of love is not. So it's dependent on it's about mutual dependence. It's not about autonomy. It's not about equality. So I think you get an idea of how relationships work in the South Asian society, but we'll talk more about that if we get time. But this is what I want to tell you. I wanted to tell you. And now this is my question. Like, everything has a beginning, everything has a start. So before the Swedish theory of love came into effect in Sweden, what type of a society was Sweden before that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And of course, as an historian, I tend to think in terms of long term, what you can think of as sticky structures and values, right? So one of the points in the book is that this is not just simply an invention, of modern, social democracy that's our sort of having power from, let's say, the mid-1930s and until fairly recently. But it has to do with certain type of long-term, right, structural and value type of aspects of Swedish culture. So what we're trying to argue in the book is that there's a long tradition in Sweden of autonomy and freedom being central values. Right? For one thing, right, we did not have, which you did in pretty much all the rest of Europe, a tradition of serfdom, right? Where peasants that were sort of the lower levels of society were inserted in sort of slave-like relations, right? Instead, you had, a history of free-owning peasants that owned their own land, and they were very, very jealous in terms of keeping their freedom and autonomy intact, right? So there was that part, right, which then, becomes very important when we come to the 19th century and the so-called popular movements in Sweden, social movements that are really central to the emergence of modern democracy. So that part is part of the story that has this longer kind of feature. Related to that is the centrality of rule of law. So Sweden, was a society that even before it became a state proper, was based on an idea of a community of law, which in turn, right, tended to emphasize equality and autonomy because it had to, because it was legal, right? It wasn't, something embedded in more sort of clan-like or family-like structures. And then the last element that we stress a lot is what we call the European marriage pattern, right? And what this is about is that, I'm just talking about Europe. Of course, as your comment points out, of course, these discussions are relevant globally, right? The issues and questions that this book is about are really, in some sense, universal, even though Sweden is a particular, perhaps in some sense, extreme case. But the fundamental tensions and issues are universal. And the European marriage pattern is interesting because there is a big difference between Northern and Western Europe on the one hand and Southern and Eastern Europe on the other. So in the South and the East, we tend to have a family pattern that is based on large families, where you see women marrying when they're very young, right, to men that are considerably older. It might be a 10-year difference in age, right, as a normal thing. These women, but also the men, become then inserted into these extended family structures that are very, not just patriarchal, but they are also very hierarchical. Right? So there is a clear sense of sort of pyramid, where, if you're on a lower level, right, you really are inserted and dependent, on those who are in charge, right? Both in the family, but also in a broader kind of clan-like structure. Whereas in the North and the West, like where the Nordic countries are located, men and women tended to marry around the same age, around 25, 26. They formed very small families, like nuclear families, from a very early time. And they tended then to have a more equal ratio, partly just because of the fact that they were at around the same age, but also because they were not inserted into these broader, larger family structures. And because they were often then had their own farm, they needed assistance. And so when their kids, right, were younger, they would enter hire older, younger people from other families and farms to come to them to work for a period. And when their own children were older, then their kids would go to work elsewhere. And that translated into kind of an encouragement of a certain type of autonomy also for young people, right? So you see how that kind of family pattern it also influences in terms of deep structures, right? Creates a certain type of condition of possibility. So that when we enter into the modern period, we see how both at the political level in terms of expectations of freedom, that leads into kind of democracy and sort of ideas of that ideal is that you have equal and autonomous citizens, along with, right, the kind of proto, right, feminist or pro-children's rights kind of ideas, right? They become then sort of instrumentalized and they are mutated into more modern forms, right? But the point here that in a democracy, right, in Sweden, you can propose any kind of crazy scheme that you want, but unless the citizens, right, think that, oh yeah, that feels pretty good from my point of view, you're not going to be successful. So you take these really radical proposals like individual taxation or moving, right, the responsibility for the elderly, right, from family, to the collective institutions of the state. Or you say that children, young people should be able to get student loan and student assistance without having to ask their parents for permission or depend on them, right? These ideas would seem pretty radical, even in countries that seem pretty similar to Sweden, right? Germany or the United States that we compare in this book, right? Not to mention many countries in the rest of the world, right? Where family values, right, and responsibilities are even more important, often because you don't have always a well-functioning state or a social contract. So in Sweden, there were certain conditions that made this possible at that time.
Yeah, I understand. And I also was reading the European marriage pattern, the Nordic marriage pattern in your book. So there was this, I came across this word, I don't know if I can pronounce it correctly, nattfrieri. It's night courting.
Yeah, right. Yes, very good. Your Swedish is great.
Okay, because I lived in Finland. So Finland is bilingual, with Swedish being one of the official languages. So I know some Swedish words. And also there is this sambo relationship, like cohabitation.
Yes,
right, in Sweden. So you wrote about this, how these relationships influenced the relationship in the Nordic societies, especially in Sweden back in that time, and also how actually those made the foundation of why people in Sweden enjoyed this much of autonomy and equality. So I really liked that part of your book, and I was reading it again and again to really understand how these things was. And as you said, it's actually true, because history determines a lot of things for any nation. So I recently wrote an article about the high historical equality in the Nordic countries, and also their high happiness levels in the present time. So in the World Happiness Report for Nordic academicians, they also said this, the Nordic countries are so happy these days because they are historically equal. You talked about peasant culture, you talked about farmers, they own their own land, which was not the case in many other European countries and also in Russia. So they pointed this out, that this is one of the main reasons. And they said it was unique. So you cannot actually question why the peasant culture was like this in the Nordic countries. The answer is it was just like that. It was unique. So that's how they had a kind of like an advantage. But anyway, so there is a section in your book that discusses how only autonomous individuals can be equal. My question is, why is autonomy key to equality, and how does this fit into the Swedish theory of love or the modern Swedish society as we know it today?
Yeah, no, it's not a very good question, and you're absolutely right. That we pose that as a kind of a central kind of coupling, and I think the point is that only people who are autonomous can really make free decisions, right? So if you're dependent on somebody else, let's say you're married, right? And you're a woman, your husband makes the money, it's hard to know, right? Does she really love him, or is she with him because she depends on him, right? So by not being autonomous, everything else, right, is thrown into question, right? Is it love? Is it freedom? Or is it just something that's, you're stuck in, right, in some sense? So that the coupling of equality and autonomy is really critical, right? Because autonomous individuals, right, are already in that very sense equals, right? Because they have some kind of power, free will, right, that will allow them to make decisions that is also reassuring to the other person, right? Because there's a sort of existential kind of equality that is based, on this foundation of autonomy. And if you look, for example, you talked about happiness, right? If you look at the elderly in Sweden, who are actually, it's an issue that comes up in debates also in Sweden. Are they lonely? Because they are actually living by themselves. Sweden has the highest, Stockholm especially, the highest degree of single household residences in the world, right? So many people, right, live by themselves. And so you might think, living by yourself, it means that you're lonely, right? And especially with older people who, of course, lose friends. The longer you live, in some sense, the more lonely you will be, or alone you will be, because by definition, right, you won't have as many of your friends alive, right? So then the family should become even more important. So there's an assumption here sometimes also in the debate in Sweden, right, about loneliness. We write a little bit in the book because it's a theme that you see through, from a long time, a kind of a stereotype, right, about, I want to be alone, and, this kind of, idea, sort of loneliness. But when you look statistically, specifically asking the question you're talking about now, about happiness, you find that the elderly in Sweden and in the Nordic countries, I mean, I talk about Sweden because, Swedes, have to be careful. If we say too much about the Danes or the Norwegians or the Finns, they will get, all excited and explain how much different they are and much better they are. And so, I stay away from that, right? I like Anu a lot, and she's done a wonderful job, but, she's in danger of, that kind of prison.
Yeah.
But, they are so similar in so many ways. So, in that sense, I totally agree with her approach. But if you look at the data, then it's what happened, what you see, right, is that the elderly in Sweden have actually more, right, of these kind of networks with people, and therefore they tend to be more satisfied. And the interesting thing is that the reason that they are is because those networks, those friendships they have, even within the family, because they are voluntary, because they don't actually need them, right? They are chosen. So they are with people that makes them happy, as opposed to being stuck with people just because they depend on them and that may not make them happy. Right? So if you compare Sweden with countries in Southern and Eastern Europe that are more sort of family values, if you will, you'll see that the Nordics, at least if we are to believe what they say, right? Maybe they're lying, I don't know, but I don't think so. So it's a super interesting question. It's very existential, So it's not just about sort of politics, or it's really how people experience life, right? And I think your questions are so interesting because I think it's important to understand this. I was in New York, in the fall in the book tour when the book first came out, and I was lecturing for a lot of young people who were in these mixed marriages or relationships, right? One Swede and when the other one would be American usually, right? And I said to them, look, this book, you should think of this book as a kind of a how to survive in a relationship with a Swede, right? Because it's some some sense is a key to understanding not just the social contract at some sort of institutional level, but what makes it tick, for better and worse, right? Because it's not all, I mean, there are definitely sides to it that if you're used to a different culture, it will, might turn some people off, right? Because of this kind of emphasis, autonomy, and freedom.
Yeah, exactly. And you wrote this in your book, and I really liked it. So you quoted someone, I forgot her name, but she is also a Swedish academic. So you quoted her saying, old people prefer intimacy at a distance and do not want to depend upon their children in Sweden. Right. So I think that kind of captures the central idea. You know what? I mean, when you think about this, intimacy at a distance, maybe for people who are like me, who live in a very community-based culture and grew up in this country and in this culture, so it might be very hard for them to understand these concepts, and they will immediately criticize these relationships and this type of setting. They will be saying things like, maybe the Swedish young people, they do not care about their parents. They do not want to take care of their older parents. But if you really understand the core value of this idea, like intimacy at a distance, because they don't want to depend on their children. They want the love to come freely from within, from their heart. Yeah. So the idea is that I do not want to interact with you because I am dependent on you in some ways, maybe financially or socially. I want to interact with you. I want to talk to you. I want to be with you because I really enjoy your company. So exactly. It's something like that. So there is no obligation. You don't have to force me. I don't have to force you, or you don't have to force me, So it's totally voluntary because we like each other. So we are with each other. And that's how this love is built. This relationship is built. And also I came across this quote in your book. So it says, although most people do not want to live without love, they're resistant to love that leads to an asymmetric power relationship. So can you talk about this? Because, this is so interesting. If people could just understand this asymmetric power relationship when you have a codependent relationship in love or in family. So can you please talk about that a little bit?
And you've already talked a little bit about it, I think, actually, and very well. And I think it's a really interesting conversation to have, right? Because I totally understand when people come up with this sort of critique or saying like, right? And that's why we had this sort of provocative Swedish child or Swedish human. I mean, because they could possibly conceive of being sort of slightly autistic or inhuman and sort of kind of cold or something like that, right? But the thing is, and this is something I always have to point out, is that just because you have this strong statist individualistic tradition in Sweden doesn't mean that the family is not important, right? Swedes are actually, there was just an article in New York Times today, about sort of how a country like Italy is now in a position of shrinking. Right? Because, they don't make bambinos anymore, right? And one reason they don't make babies is because it's just so difficult, right, for especially women, right, to combine having a family with doing something else for themselves in their lives, right? So they essentially choose to not have kids. Now, in the Nordic countries, you see much more of the kind of an ability to combine these things, and it's has not just simply to do with things like free daycare or schooling, although those things are really important, right? But it's also about the things you and I have talked about. That is to say, you can have a family. You want to have a family. Children are great. It's fun to be a family together. But it's even better, right, when you actually want to be there. Right? So that if you have a possibility of leaving, right, with it becoming a disaster, either economically or socially, right? And both of these are important, right? So in Sweden, you have a reasonably high divorce rate, not spectacularly different from other Western European countries. But the point is not, really that they are sort of dispersing and rich family lives, quite a lot of children, right? Oftentimes, over time, maybe they divorce and remarry, so the families are a little bit odd, we call it the bonus family in Sweden. So it's a positive word. You married someone and she already had 3 kids and you had 4 kids. You have a small community right there. And so the point is not that they are against family. The point is what you yourself brought up so well, right? Namely, that you want those relationships, even those relationships that have to do with family and love, to be based, on something voluntary, something that you actually want to be in. So I think this is the key. And this has not just become a matter now of, let's say, all of the different laws and institutions that have been created in Sweden since the 1930s, especially since, let's say, 1970. But it also has become something that is part of the culture, part of the values, right? You don't see this as strange, right? You don't think that a divorce is like the end of the world, right? You don't think that children's right, is some kind of horrible thing that it threatens you as a parent, right? And elderly and the grown children agree, right, that it's better to have arrangements that maximize freedom over, forced community. So it's become acceptable too. And I think this is the hardest part to kind of get your head around if you're in a different culture that's much more family oriented, because you realize that even if you change the laws, they will take a long time before people feel comfortable, right? With that kind of moral logic that for Swedes today is almost like second nature. Right.
Yeah, I got it. So one of the criticisms of greater individualism and independence in Nordic relationships is that it weakens family relationships and the emotional bonding of couples.
Right.
So I want to know your opinion on this. How do you see this?
Look, I just spoke about it, right? And I sort of suggested that in general, right, people are able to navigate this pretty well, right? There's no evidence, right, that Swedes or Nordics are more unhappy than other people, as you yourself pointed out. I think in our email correspondence, right? So it's the contrary. So the thing to explain is not really that you have these countries that are so let's say so individualized that they are no longer marrying, having children, or happy. There's no evidence for that. So the thing to explain is really how come, given this individualism and this stress on autonomy, how come they are still having children and having families, So, and I think we've spoken about that. Now, it of course does not mean that there are not cases. Sure, at the individual level, right? Of course, in Sweden, you have people who are involuntarily alone, right? You are unhappy. You have people who have all sorts of other routes for happiness. They may not find a partner and so forth, right? This is not paradise, right? It's not as if there are not unhappy people in Sweden. Of course there are, right? But I don't think there's a sort of a general, right, sort of as a general rule, right, that this emphasis on equality and autonomy is something that leads, right, to a kind of a social disaster, right? If anything, the evidence seems to go or point in the other direction, right?